Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to give people just a minute to join us. Thank you so much for joining part 3 of the 3-part series talking about Chosen, Stephen Mill's book. So wonderful to have you all back. Hi, for those of you who are joining us on Facebook this evening. Thank you for those of you who are logging in on Zoom. We have some incredible guests this evening. I'm so excited. It's so wonderful to be back. Just going to give everyone just another minute to sign in. Don't forget, the chat feature is open. And so if you would like to introduce yourself, let us know where you're from. If you work for an organization that works on child protection or child justice, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much to those of you who are watching this evening. So this is the 3rd session of a 3-part series, and it is actually the inaugural event for Darkness to Light's Honoring Their Voices series. And it's a brand new virtual series with the goal of amplifying the voices of survivors and others with lived experience of child sexual abuse. And we talk about anything from books to art to travel and conversations, therapy, you name it. It's what the survivors are looking for, and it's our opportunity to amplify their lived experience. So I just want to say hello to everyone who's in the chat. Thank you so much. I see a lot of people from the Midwest, Lincoln, Nebraska. I think, Lisa, that might be the first time I've seen a Lincoln, Nebraska at one of these events. Proud board member, hello, Andrea Honrar, who was also one of our guests in the first session. Jim, I know Andrea is very excited to hear everything you have to say today. So just a little bit of housekeeping for everyone before we start. I just want to let you know that all participants are muted. So if you have questions versus just conversation, please make sure you put your questions into the Q&A feature in Zoom. If you're on Facebook, you can put that in the chat, and we have our wranglers making sure that I get all of the questions and comments. So we'll make sure that we try and answer some of those questions towards the end. The chat is for networking. So say hello, share the things you do, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, comment on all the amazing things that our speakers are going to talk about today. And I just also want to remind everyone, I will get a little vulnerable for a second. I texted Stephen after the last session and said, that one was a little rough for me. I definitely needed to take a walk after hearing some of the points that Dr. Yao made. And so, if you are feeling the same way, you should know that this is a safe space, and that if you need to talk to someone, there are options available for you. You can call 1-866-4-LIGHT, or you can text the word light to the number 741-741. Both of those are free. They're 24 hours. And please, I know my team will put that in the chat, so you all have that for the reference. For those of you who are wondering, this is available on Facebook and YouTube after it ends. Please give us just a little bit of time on YouTube. We translate into Spanish with subtitles because we want it to be available for all. And so that takes about 2 weeks, but it will be there. In the meantime, please be sure to follow us on social media. We're on all the platforms you would expect. And finally, before we start, I just want to remind people, sometimes you hear things that you don't agree with and make you angry, and that's fine, but I just ask that you be respectful and refrain from inappropriate or harmful comments. This is a safe space here, and we just want to keep it a learning space. All right, without further ado, I'll just recap a little bit. In January, we started this process. As I mentioned, we had Andrea Honrar, who is a forensic interviewer, along with Stephen, to talk about the first part of Stephen's book, really where we focused on the issues surrounding grooming and manipulation of the child in both the family and in organizational settings. And then in February, Stephen and I were joined by Dr. Julie Yao, who's a trauma therapist, and we spent some time talking about what a traumatic experience looks like in many forms, and the long-term effects that it has on the human body and on the mind. And so tonight, I'm really excited to wrap up this three-part series and turn the discussion towards a conversation based on justice. Stephen and I are joined by two other survivors and fierce advocates for child sexual abuse prevention and justice, Jim Clemente and Kathryn Robb. Jim and Kathryn, I'd love for you to take a moment to introduce yourself. Kathryn, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you for that. And so honored to be a part of this great group. So yeah, I'm the executive director of Child U.S. Advocacy. We work on passing child protection legislation all over the country. Our primary focus is on reforming statute of limitations so they reflect the science of delayed disclosure and trauma, and give survivors the opportunity for justice, and also the opportunity to expose hidden predators and also failing institutions that have, horrific practices and procedures and policies in place. So we're very active across the country. I am also a survivor of child sexual abuse. I was abused in the family for about 8 years. So I do bring that sort of vision of the survivor as well. And, quite frankly, when I testify, and meet with lawmakers, as I'm meeting with someone on the Hill tomorrow morning, I also bring the vision of a parent, and what we need to do to protect our children. So this is a long path, and, along this, great people like you, Katelyn, and I meet Stephen, and it's an honor to work with so many great people. So we will continue this fight in legislative bodies across the country.
Jim?
I'm Jim Clemente. I'm a retired FBI profiler, a former New York City prosecutor. I write and produce now in the multiple mediums, but I'm also a survivor of child sexual victimization, and I was fortunate enough to be able to go after the guy who molested me, but unfortunately, the church that protected him continues to do the same kind of thing over and over again, and that's why things like this are so important. And when I met Stephen just about a year ago, I guess, when I read his book, and I found a tremendous number of parallels between his life and my life, and we've now become very good friends in a very short period of time. And I'm also honored to be here to help in this fight, because he's a warrior and he deserved a lot better justice than he got.
Yeah, agreed. So, Stephen, part 3 of your book is entitled Reckoning, and it describes your attempts to stop a serial predator and get justice. And I guess when I think about that, I wonder, is there a pivotal moment on your journey that your quest for justice began?
Yeah, there were actually 2 pivotal moments, and I'll talk a little bit about both, because hearing about both will give you an idea of what survivors are up against if you try to stop a perpetrator, and if you go to law enforcement. So the first moment was when I was 23 years old, which was about 8 years after the abuse ended. When I was 23, I discovered that Dan Farinella, who was the social worker and camp director who had abused me, was abusing other boys at a camp in Illinois. I'd been abused in Connecticut and New York. When I got over my shock, because I really was in shock, I had thought I was the only one, not uncommon. The first thing I did was talk to some employees of the camp where Farinella was working, and I quickly realized that several of the employees had known for at least 2 years what he was doing, and were unwilling for lots of reasons, none of them good in my mind, unwilling to blow the whistle on him. or even anonymously to report. And so it sort of briefly occurred to me to go to law enforcement, but mind you, this was 1978. I was so deep in shame and fear of him. I was terrified to death that he would kill me, based on what I had experienced, of course, as a kid. And so I decided I was going to confront him and see if I couldn't get him to stop. And so there's a scene in the book which recounts that, my confrontation with him. And as Jim has pointed out, he orchestrated it in classic Predator style, by making it happen in his kind of enclosed in his station wagon in the pouring rain, and which really amped up my fear. And he told me what I wanted to hear, which was that, he admitted what he had done to me and others. He said, no more, I'm getting out of camping. It was everything I wanted to hear, problem solved. I could move on with my life. Of course, he didn't stop. But fast forward 8 years, and I found out I'm now 31 years old. And I learned that he's moved on to another camp in West Virginia, and he's also the supervisor of youth programs for a Jewish social service agency in Pittsburgh. And, at that point, I had just gotten into therapy, and for the first time in my life, I was really beginning to understand what had happened to me. I finally had a safe place to disclose. I was feeling, the effects of what had happened, realizing just how horrific an operator he was and how far-reaching the damage must have been to so many kids. It had just I could never really grasp it, until then. And, at that point, my sense of anger at him and outrage at his employers, because this had been going on now for 26 years through a series of 5 different social service agencies. All of that overrode my fear of him. And I decided I was going to do something I had fantasized about but never done, which was to try to track down other victims from my camp. This is going back to the late 60s now, and we're now 20 years later in the 80s. And it was kind of mortifying because I thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to, call up all these old childhood friends and tell them what happened to me. And they're going to say, no, I never heard anything like that. And I'm going to have to just, call 100 people. And lo and behold, the very first call produced the names of 5 victims. So, this is how pervasive, right, this activity was and his crime spree was. And I got statements from several victims. I got statements from witnesses in multiple states. And this is short form. This took a lot of doing, it's just to say, and delivered all of that to both the FBI in Lower Manhattan, which had a joint task force with NYPD that Jim knows well for lots of different reasons that I'm sure he may share. And I also sent it all to the DA in Pittsburgh. And, I had no clue how these things work. I thought, oh, well, I'm just going to hand this off to law enforcement. And the FBI was incredibly encouraging. In fact, the first thing the agent said who interviewed me was, okay, this guy wasn't just violating state law, he was violating the Mann Act. He was transporting you and your fellow victims across the state line from New York to Connecticut as minors. That's a federal felony. Of course, the catch was our cases were beyond the statute of limitations, which had run out years earlier. And this, of course, will become relevant when Kathryn and Jim will address it, why statutes are so, reforming them are so crucial. And we were really caught on that. So all we had was this historic evidence. It was given over to law enforcement. They were very encouraging. And the next thing I know, I get a The first call I get from the DA in Pittsburgh saying that the Pittsburgh Police Department wanted to investigate and find current victims, and they were going to decide how to proceed within a couple of weeks. And the next call I get from the DA says, he had overruled the Pittsburgh police sergeant who wanted to investigate, who was the head of the sexual assault squad, by the way, and decided that if kids were being abused by Dan Farinella, they needed to get him out as quickly as possible. And so they had a sit down with the Jewish Community Center of Pittsburgh, his employer, and obviously struck a deal that let him leave quietly, and they weren't going to pursue it further. At the same time, he said that it was going to be up to the FBI to investigate and prosecute. And in fact, I then went through several months more with the FBI, who kept the guy on point there in the Pittsburgh field office, kept promising me that they were going to investigate, they were going to interview me, the other victims, they were going to develop a case and bring it to the U.S. attorney in Western Pennsylvania. None of that ever happened. So, the whole thing was really just a terrible, really a catastrophic failure on so many levels, because, forget about my case, that was way in the rearview mirror. But, this guy was now out free again with no constraints, right? Number one. Number two, the way that it was done, the Jewish Community Center kept it quiet and never breathed a word to the community. So here you've got, victims and victims' families, who never had the resources and support they were due in the community. So, this one pretty much checked all the boxes of what should never happen. And I'll leave it at that.
I look straight to you, Jim. As a retired FBI profiler, what should the FBI have done?
Well, what's crazy about this is that Steve and I went to exactly the same squad in the New York division, the FBI NYPD Joint Sexual Exploitation of Children Task Force, and we told our stories. We both did our own major investigation before we even went to them, and yet we got exactly opposite results. And that's not what should have happened. What should have happened is they should have taken the good work that Stephen did and continued, finish the investigation, investigate, interview all the victims and witnesses, tracked his career, the offender's career, look for more victims, execute search warrants, interview him and arrest him, and then prosecute and sentence and register him as a sex offender. All of those things should have happened. Instead, what happened was, like Steve said, quietly walked away. And then
We lost your hearing.
Jim, we lost your hearing, so I'm just going to move on to Kathryn for a second. We've talked a little bit about this, but I want to hear.
I hopefully now you can hear me. If I turn off the video, hopefully that'll help.
We got you.
Okay.
Let's do it.
So I don't know where you lost me, but in the case of the offender, the Catholic Church allowed him to go to 13 different Catholic schools over 23 years.
This is in your case now, Jim. You're talking
in my
about.
case, yes.
Yeah.
In my case. So that what we really needed was the church to step up and actually warn people and stop doing this. Unfortunately, as we know, that hasn't happened yet. And this is many years later. But this Stevens case was the perfect case for the FBI to step in. It was multi-jurisdictional. There were federal violations, and it should have been pursued with every bit of vigor that my case was pursued. And it's just a terrible, terrible stain that it was not done that way.
Jim, do you think that discrepancies because yours was handled by the field bureau in Lower Manhattan and mine was out in Pittsburgh and just totally different cultures?
I just think, I don't know about different cultures, but certainly different people. The fact is that the agent that was assigned to my case, Al McDonald, was dogged. He never gave up. He interviewed and interviewed. He went back and re-interviewed kids because he was trying to get current victims, and he was able to do that. In your case, I don't know if they did that at all, or if they just made that deal and let him just slink away. But clearly they never interviewed you. They never utilized all the hard work that you put into it. And the fact that you basically handed them a case. So I don't know what was going on behind the scenes, but I do know that that agent did not provide justice in this case, and you were not served by the justice system as a result.
And
Nor were
I could
any of
just-
the other
yeah,
victims. Yeah.
If I could just jump in right now, when they're looking for current victims, it's always because the law is not on their side. It's always because the statute of limitations, whether it be civil or criminal, and they know that, right? And that's why, you know, we work so hard to change the statute of limitations. You know, they don't want to put in the time and effort, even if they can't fully prosecute. And I'm quite certain you know this already. They can't prosecute, they can't file a claim without it being dismissed immediately. They know this. They understand what the law is, and that's why, you know, at least from my angle as a survivor and as an advocate and an expert in this area, that we fight so hard to change the laws. So both law enforcement and civil attorneys can say, hey, we can walk into a courtroom and into a courthouse and they're not going to slam the door on you, right? That's why it's so important.
Absolutely.
So you've just outlined a couple of the obstacles for the FBI, but you know, Kathryn, I'm wondering from a survivor's perspective, we already know that there's a delayed disclosure. What are some of the obstacles that survivors experience? Like, is Stephen's story the average, or is it worse? You know, like what are you typically seeing?
And when you say obstacles, you mean legal, right, Katelyn?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you can talk about both. It's up to you.
Sure. So, I mean, obviously the first thing is, who wants to stand at the, you know, on the mountaintops and yell, I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse, right? That's just really hard to do. And there's a whole host of reasons why survivors can't do that, for all the different pressures they experience in their families or in other institutions. But I think that there's just within our systems are, you know, they back, sadly, they back the bad guys, they back the status quo. And, you know, you go to an attorney and the first thing attorney says to you, at least in 23 states right now, we're trying to crack that down to 0 states, right? I'm so sorry, I can't help you because of this arbitrary rule, this in-house court rule that, you know, we're going to get hit with a motion to dismiss and we're going to lose. And it's not worth it for me as an attorney to take your case. So there's just so many obstacles there in terms of the law. And, you know, a lot of attorneys don't want to take it because they're worried about, you know, memories and all of that stuff, you know, and quite frankly, if I can just say, that's just BS, because survivors don't forget. They do not forget about this. And there's never or rarely, I know that there's one part in Stephen's book where he talks about a witness, right? There are rarely witnesses in these types of crimes, rarely. And, you know, whether it's an adult or a child, but certainly with a child, they're just, you know, it's just rare. Plaintiffs prove their case, and you know, so we see a lot of that at the legislative level. We see it, you know, with attorneys. We see it with the Catholic Church, Boy Scouts of America. And the bottom line is we have to change the laws to reflect the science of traumatology. That therefore attorneys can say, I can help you.
Give us a quick definition of traumatology.
It is the science of understanding how the mind reacts to a traumatic event. And with kids, and certainly with Stephen's case, and it was my personal experience as well, it was repeated trauma. So what does that do to that victim, especially when the victim is a child and their brain development is not, at the level of an adult, which, by the way, doesn't happen to 25. I can say this as a mother of teenagers and college kids, right? We know that the brain doesn't stop fully developing. So therefore, the processing of this trauma is really hard. There's a ton of data on, the increase in cortisol levels and all of that maybe should be another event. But so we know that all of that trauma really shuts down the victim, and they have experiences of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, sleeping disorders, that list sadly goes on and on and on. And that just really shuts down the survivors. I mean, I didn't look at my, Google Calendar and say, oh, I better file, because I'm running out of time. I was still so traumatized, and, the fear and the shame and all of that, and so one of the things I say, Katelyn, is when I'm testifying is, why should perpetrators be protected by the passage of time for the very silence they created in their victims? How is that good public policy? It's insanity, So we're trying to make those efforts on at least at the legislative level, so it can pan out into the state courts as it is done.
100%. I love you. So many points there. For the audience, I just want to let you all know that Jim and Stephen are in California. If you haven't been watching the weather, it's a bit chaotic there for them. So Stephen's power went out. He has called back in, and so just to let you know,
I'm back on. Can
him.
you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes,
Awesome.
we can. Thanks, Stephen. Jim, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yes. Kathryn, thank you for everything you just said, because you summarized, as Katelyn said, so many points. But two things I want to talk about: the memory issue. Many times victims choose words that help them internally. However, those words may hurt their case externally.
Yeah.
And when they say, I forgot about it, it was out of my mind or whatever, it was because they didn't want to think about it. But every time I've asked them the specific questions, was there ever a moment after you were victimized that you were not aware that you had been victimized and you survived sexual victimization? And they almost always say there was never such a moment, but they might describe it as a memory that came back to them or something like that. And legally, as a former prosecutor, as a lawyer, I can say that defense attorneys will drive a train through that kind of a situation. So we have to be careful. And then the other part about the statute of limitations, those statutes of limitations were created at a time when evidence was fleeting. We now have science and technology and the ability to bring evidence back from not only tens of years, but hundreds of years. We don't need statute of limitations. We can present cases today that happened decades and decades ago. And that's why it's just completely outdated in terms of our system today.
And Jim, the other thing too, Jim, is that, these perpetrators don't have one victim. It is very rare. The average is like over 96, excuse me. So it's not just one victim's word against the perpetrator, right? There are, Stephen points this out in his book, right? There are multiple victims all the time, and probably a ton that have never had the ability to come forward, sadly.
So Stephen, 30 years after you tried to stop Dan Farinelli, you got a second chance at justice. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, you're referring, of course, to the passage of the Child Victims Act in New York in 2019, which, Kathryn and many others worked very hard for. And it opened a look-back window. I mean, amongst other things, it reformed criminal and civil statutes of limitations, but it also, meaning it lengthened them for victims, but then it opened a look-back window which allowed people like me to file a claim no matter how long ago the sexual abuse had occurred. It was initially a 1-year window. It was then, because of COVID, lengthened to 2 years. And of course, at this point, the perpetrator who had abused me was long dead. So, the option open to me was filing suit against his employers in New York, who owned and ran the camp where I went as a kid. That was specifically UJA Federation and the YMHA of the Bronx. And, it took me the better part of a year to decide to file that claim. It was not by any means an easy call. And at the end of the day, I did it because I realized that the best way to focus the attention of these institutions is in court. Because unless they face these historic cases of child sexual abuse, they're just completely ill-equipped to deal with current cases. And, as I found out since, they have really done everything possible to continue facing what happened in the past. So, I filed my case against those two institutions in the summer of 2021. They last summer filed a motion to dismiss my claim on the basis that since most of the abuse occurred in Connecticut, they couldn't be held accountable in New York State. And, this is the kind of callous deny and delay lawyering I know that Jim is very familiar with from, the Catholic Church. And most of us have, followed for years and years across so many cases. And, I just find it particularly outrageous in this case because, Dan Farinello was, as I mentioned before, transporting me and other boys across state lines to sexually assault us in Connecticut. And here are his employees 50 years later, trying to use that fact to open a possible legal loophole, to dodge accountability. And it's outrageous. So this is why I say institutions that do not have the courage to face what happened 50 years ago, who exactly is going to have the courage there to face episodes of sexual abuse that happen this summer at camp? How will they possibly be prepared to do that?
Right. Jim, you also filed a suit under the New York Child Victims Act. How did you make that decision, and why was that important to you at the time?
Well, how I made that decision is they finally gave me the opportunity. I never had that opportunity before because when I first disclosed, it was 10 years after I was victimized and the statute of limitations had run a long time before that. So given the opportunity, of course I did it. Why? Because I never got a chance to actually call the church out for what they did and didn't do. And that is really important. And it's extremely important to me that I am actually the person who can prove that the church got notice for the 10 other guys who filed claims also. Now, there are many more victims that I know of that didn't want to go through this process. It is a very onerous process. As Steve said, the defendants will try everything in their power to get rid of the case. And that's a terrible thing. That's a horrible thing to have to go through even after all these years. But the fact that I know that this is finally my opportunity to help the guys who came after me, the guys who I wasn't, and this is a typical victim perspective, who I wasn't strong enough to help prevent. The fact is that even if I had come forward immediately after, the chances of me shutting him down are very slim. I don't know if
Katelyn, if I could just add is, by the way, I too filed under the New York Child Victims Act. In fact, I was the first case filed on August 14th, 2019. My case is still going on because it's the typical defense: delay, deny, distract. And I'm sure Jim and I know Stephen have experienced this. But I just want to say this to folks that are listening, and why this is so important is the only way institutions change, whether it's a camping institution like Steve or Jim, the Catholic Church, only way they're going to change is if they know that there's going to be potential liability. We've seen that across the board for all sorts of, bad acting institutions. The only way they change is that they know that there's going to be potential liability. That's why these changes in the laws are so important, because they're just not going to change their policies, their procedures. They're going to continue to hide and keep secrets, where people like me and Steve and Jim will never have the opportunity to share the truth of our experience, to, by the way, most importantly, to prevent it from happening to children in the future. I talk to survivors all over the country, as I'm sure almost everyone on this right now does. And the thing I hear more than anything else is not, I want money, compensation. It's, I just don't want this to happen to another kid. That we want accountability. And the only way to have accountability is to force institutions to change by the threat of liability. Sad as that may be, but that's the truth.
So I know you all have a report card. Can you talk to us a little bit about how the statute of limitations varies from state to state?
Sure. So right now we have 24 states and 3 US territories that have passed revival legislation.
Congratulations.
We have 17, I think it's 15 and two territories, 15 states that have completely eliminated it. And the federal government. We work very closely with Senator Dick Durbin. And then this year alone, which is really so exciting, we have over 33 jurisdictions that have introduced SOL reform. And 22 of those are revivals, and 10 of those are permanent windows. So that's the new future. And what I call, when I talk to lawmakers, I call this zero tolerance. Done with the BS. No, where if you touch a kid, I don't care if it happened in the past, in the future, zero tolerance, complete elimination, and open window, permanent window. That's what we're really pushing for across the country. We have a lot of work to do, but with all of the brave survivors and organizations like yours, Katelyn, we're getting it done. And it's important to protect our children in the future.
So before we move on to audience questions, I want to ask each one of you, what would it have meant if law enforcement and the judicial system had been trauma informed and had helped you at the time that you needed it the most? And Stephen, I'll start with you.
Wow. That would be a whole different life. I mean, the first thing I think about is that, today we do have children's advocacy centers, which are, is just a huge leap forward, in terms of if kids are lucky enough to find themselves there. I mean, there's more than 900 of them now. And I know a lot of folks listening on this call are from CACs. Mm-hmm. That is a huge progress. So, if I had been lucky enough in at least even in my 20s or 30s to, get immediate, be welcomed by law enforcement and supported and be offered, sort of psychological support, and to know that I would be protected as a whistleblower And
Mm.
I just think, honestly, it took me until writing the book in these last few years to realize just how re-traumatizing those couple years were when I was trying to stop Dan Farinella and trying to get law enforcement to do their job. Because it was so isolating. There was no one. I was looking around me and thinking, I must be crazy, because how come the full force of the law isn't being, why isn't the hammer being brought down? And on what universe and what planet do you let a predator go free to continue abusing kids? It was really surreal and kind of inconceivable. So I think if the counter, example had happened and they'd done everything right, I just think it would have been, I would have gotten to where I am now 35 years earlier, right? In terms of feeling seen and the crime witnessed and acknowledged, which is what most survivors want. In addition to what Kathryn was saying before about protecting kids today, most survivors just want the truth acknowledged publicly. And so for that to have happened would have been, I think, just tremendously important for me personally.
Jim?
Would you mind repeating the question? Because I blocked, I was out
It's
for a
okay.
second.
I want to ask you, where would you be and how would it have felt if law enforcement had been trauma informed and you had gotten sort of all of the help that you needed at the time that you disclosed and went through this criminal justice process?
Wow. Yeah, it would have been amazing. And I think that what I wouldn't have had to walk in.
These poor gentlemen in California.
No.
All right, we'll come back to Jim. Kathryn?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, because I never went to law enforcement. And so the way I think about it is if teachers and coaches and even my parents and even the pediatrician could have been trained or had some understanding on how trauma manifests in children, they would have known something was wrong. So if someone had just said to me, what's wrong, clearly something's wrong, I think they would have been able to see the truth in the pain of the eyes of a little 8-year-old girl, and so I think not just law enforcement has to be educated on this, but, I think that, teachers and parents and, doctors and that deal with children have to be educated on trauma. And, man, that would have just saved me, just to have someone to reach out and to say, something's wrong, you're hurting, what's going on, and maybe have stopped it.
And
Let's try again.
I'm gonna turn off my video so I stay on longer. Okay.
Okay.
But what I will echo what Kathryn just said in terms of training. Training has to be at all levels of law enforcement and the public as well, for two different reasons. The public needs to be able to know who the real offenders are. Unfortunately, when we use terms like monster predator, unfortunately, what that does is it makes everybody look away for the offenders that we all experience. 95% are people we know, not some monster hiding behind a tree. It's not always stranger danger. That's a minimal number of the cases. It happens, but it is not the most.
All right, I'm going to go on to an audience question. Sarah Austin has asked, and I'm going to, Kathryn, point this to you. Why is it so difficult to change these laws? Who other than the offenders are benefiting from the statute of limitations?
Institutions are benefiting. predators are benefiting. That's why I always say when I testify, do we really want laws that protect the perpetrator that silences the victim? How does that make any sense? It's almost like, saying to a victim, just taking a, bat and breaking their legs and saying, why aren't you running to the far side of the football field, right? It's that type of thing. They benefit. And that's why we see like the lobbyists from the Catholic conferences across the country. That's why we see the American tort reform lobbyists testifying all the time. And in fact, I'm pretty sure the American tort reform guy that testifies all the time shakes a little bit when he sees me on the witness list. But that's why we see this, because they're representing, bigger organizations and also the insurance company. And one of the things we've been saying is the insurance company has to get on the right side of these things, maybe have annual audits, and if, just like if I'm driving and if I'm a bad driver, my premiums go up, right? So if I'm an organization and I don't take care of kids, my premiums go up. And if I'm a really bad driver, I don't get insurance. Same thing with an institution. If they're really bad about protecting kids, they're not insurable. If an institution is not insurable, they can't function. So, we're pushing for all of these organizations that are fighting against us to protect their own deep pockets and their image, just to simply do the right thing for the sake of children.
Yeah. I often think about that image component. I mean, it's a double-edged sword, right? You don't want the Boy Scouts to go away, because there are millions of children who had wonderful experiences growing up as Cub Scouts and whatnot. And at the same time, there are tens of thousands of young boys whose lives were altered forever because the Boy Scouts were negligent in their ability to keep kids safe under their watch. And so, it's not as, people always say, well, you can't just, get rid of every institution. And I always come back with, that's not what we're trying to do. Institutions are made up of imperfect people, and we have to have a culture of child safety first. And laws and laws that are changing, that Child USA or Child US Advocacy is working on, are helping us get to that place where institutions are forced to create that culture where it's a child safety first.
Yeah.
So Jim, Stephen, I would like to pose this next question to you. It's an anonymous attendee, and they have asked, what's the best way to help a victim feel okay after a prosecutor has decided not to pursue charges?
I think that there are, in my mind, the most important thing, the most empowering thing is to do the best you can, especially if you're, in other words, pursuing the just and right course without being attached to the outcome, because it's out of our hands. I mean, so few cases are prosecuted, even fewer end in conviction. And so, I think for a survivor, I would say, I feel your pain for how horribly, let down and, the anguish and further sense of betrayal. But, by stepping forward and bringing a case, be it criminal or civil, every time that happens, that is a huge step forward in changing the calculus of how our culture and law enforcement, the public, looks at these cases. And, in some ways it's a numbers game, and the more the better. And if a lot of them don't end in, aren't finally prosecuted or end in conviction, so be it. But, we've got to turn the tide. And I do believe the tide is turning. So I think, everyone has got a small part to play. Win or lose in my civil case, I will never have a second's remorse about having brought it.
The next question from Madeline Bayless is, most of the discussion of lawsuits focuses on criminal cases. Is there any use of civil litigation to exact liability and publicize the issues?
That's
Jim?
exactly what we're doing. That's exactly what the Child Victim Act has allowed us to do finally. We still have certain strictures, but one of the things I want to happen in my case is I want to make sure that no organization on this planet is allowed to do internal investigations, that there are mandated reporters, and those reporters should report documented reports to law enforcement immediately whenever there's an allegation. Let trained professionals do that, not people who have a bias, who want to maintain the reputation of their organization. That should be illegal to do that. And I hope that we can get those laws changed along with the statute of limitations laws.
Yeah, I mean, Jim, it's very much like the fox watching the hen house, right? It just doesn't flip and work, right? And
Not
if I could
not
just
when you have an organization that has its own country and can send documents out of the country in diplomatic pouches and protect the people that they know. They're moving around like chess pieces because they won't. If somebody's offending in one state, the church will send them to another state for counseling, because those psychologists only have to report if the crimes are within their jurisdiction, not in another jurisdiction. So they're doing this purposefully to reduce the amount of cases they have to report. It's wrong. It should be illegal. It probably is.
Which is where another anonymous attendee asks the question, how do churches keep getting away with this? Their point is that it's not just Catholics, it's all churches, and they seem to have no conscience. Kathryn?
It is all churches, every religious denomination, and it's not just religion, it's every organization. So there's a couple of ways they get around it, what Jim just said, moving people out of state. But right now, the big battle for me is bankruptcy. They're filing for bankruptcy, and Chapter 11 bankruptcy is, there's no other way to say it, is bullshit, in my opinion, because you don't have to be insolvent to file Chapter 11 bankruptcy. You also get to hide a ton of records. Victims have very little voice. So that, by the way, that's the next, real angle of attack that we're going after, is because, we open up these statute of limitations, and these big institutions then immediately file for bankruptcy. And really, Chapter 11 was for, good faith, honest businesses that fell on hard times, not a clearinghouse for child sexual abuse, right? Mm-hmm. So I think we just have to keep going after the laws and getting to the root of where these institutions find their protection, because they're going to find it. They hire, big attorneys and big firms that get paid $1,000 an hour, and they find these little loopholes in what to do, and we just have to keep knocking them down, and that's certainly what we're doing. But there's just a lot of laws that serve them and don't serve the common good, which is, of course, protecting children and honoring just basic notions of justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm just reading your comment, Madeline. Yes, it is inherent power and presumed trust that gets leveraged against children. That's 100% correct. I totally agree. Well, we are in the final 5 minutes of this evening's discussion, and so I would love to give everyone a last word. Jim, I'll start with you.
Well, first of all, I thank you, Katelyn, for all the work that you and your organization and Andrea do. I mean, you have my heartfelt thanks. And Kathryn, thank you for fighting the politicians, which is an even more difficult battle, because they are entrenched and they have money and they have lawyers and lobbyists that fight against you. And thank you for doing that. And I also want to thank Stephen, who has become a dear friend to me. And my biggest regret is that I didn't get out of the FBI Academy fast enough to be able to work on his case, because I was in the FBI Academy when he went to the same unit that I had gone to. And I ended up in the FBI, but I didn't get to meet Stephen until this past year. So I'm glad, Stephen, that I did finally get to meet you. And we are going to be two more very strong fighters in this army, along with Kathryn and Katelyn and Darkness to Light, to actually get this out from under this rug that people keep trying to sweep it under.
Thank you, Jim. Kathryn?
Yeah.
Oh, Stephen, go ahead.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Oh, I was just going to say amen to all that from Jim. And, it is, I've learned so much. I always do, listening to Jim and Kathryn, because they have such a wealth of expertise in the legal realm, for one thing, which I don't have. So it always gives me a lot of perspective on how high the stakes are and how the game gets played by these institutions and by lawmakers, and the concerted effort that it's going to take, on these fronts, both in the courts and in legislatures, to change the rules of the game. And kudos to Darkness to Light as well for making not just this discussion possible, but for really just changing the way that institutions train their employees, so that kids needn't go through what the three of us went through. And that's so crucial. And I just think you're having a huge impact that is, growing larger and larger.
Yep. So, Kathryn?
Yeah, well, of course, thank you to Darkness to Light and Katelyn and Jim and Steve for everyone's brave work and important work. But I always think about the folks that may be listening, and I just, as a survivor and someone who has a really big heart about this, not just my legal mind, but my heart is to say that, we believe you and you're not alone. And, I'm never going to retire. Apparently, I keep telling my wife I'm never going to retire, because we have a lot of work to do, but it's really important work for justice. And it's an honor to work with all of these survivors and these organizations.
100%.
Amen.
Thank you, Kathryn and Jim, for being our experts this evening. And I just have to say to Stephen, reading your book months ago was just mind-blowing. You have a true gift. Your art is beautiful, and your ability to transpose your lived experience into words that make me feel like I was there, and change, even though I've been doing this work for so many years, it just reignited my passion for all things child safety. And so I'm sad that you're not on video, so I can't see you, but I just want to say to you, thank you for giving your time to Darkness to Light and your story to the world, and anything that we can do to continue to support your journey and celebrate you, we are here for it. So this has been an honor to host
Thanks so
this.
much, Katelyn. Really, really
Of
means a lot
course.
to me.
Of course. And I would be remiss if I did not thank our behind the scenes team at Darkness to Light, particularly Tracy Leonard, who wrote all the beginnings and the questions and the ends and the edits and got on the Zoom and helped Stephen log in when he's having technical issues. And I'm so grateful to you, Tracy. You've done such a fabulous job. And thank you. For those of you who are looking for this recording, we will have it on YouTube and Facebook. Please do not forget to take care of yourself tonight. Talking about this can be traumatic. Drink your water, do your meditation, take a walk, whatever makes you feel like you can come back to center. Don't forget that there are free resources. You can text the word light to 741-741 or call 1-866-4-LIGHT. Thank you so much for everything that all of you do on the phone. And like Kathryn said, we believe you and you are not alone. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thank you.